The Great Uprising of 1857, Chapter 9. In this chapter, we shall learn the reasons of the uprising, one immediate cause, leaders and the spread of uprising, consequences of uprising, and nature of uprising. Before we move on to the reasons, let us have a look into the background of the revolt. In the previous chapters, we have learned about the entry of English East India Company, which, with the sense of trading, gradually entered into politics and the administrative system, and from traders they became our rulers. So the British conquest of India and the consolidation of its rule was gradually now being resented by the Indians. This resentment was because of exploitation, because of some socio-religious causes, because of some military causes, and one immediate cause that we shall learn in this chapter ahead. To begin with, we'll go on with the political causes. Under the political causes, we have the British policy of control and gradual extinction of the native Indian states was one of the major grievances of the Indian rulers. So since the Battle of Plassey, East India Company's territorial power had increased rapidly. So the British was trying to expand its political power in India, for which it had opted for few ways, such as subsidiary alliance, by outright wars, or by adopting the doctrine of lapse, and on the pretext of alleged misrule. Then Bahadur Shah Zafar, the Mughal ruler, was under the protection of the company and was receiving a pension from the government. Now Lord Dalhousie announced that the successors of Bahadur Shah Zafar would not be permitted to use the Red Fort as their palace, and they were required to shift to a place near the Qutub Minar. In 1856, there was another announcement made by Lord Canning that after the death of Bahadur Shah, his successors would not be allowed to use imperial titles with their names. This decision of the British hurt the feelings or sentiments of the Muslims. So they consequently, Zeenat Mahal, wife of Bahadur Shah, began plotting against the British. Nana Sahib was the adopted son of Bajirao II and the last Peshwa, was also refused to grant the pension they were paying to Bajirao II by the Britishers. So Nana Sahib was now forced to live at Kanpur, which was far away from his family seat at Pune. This was widely resented again in the Maratha region. A lady warrior, Rani Lakshmi Bai of Jhansi, became a bitter enemy of the British when her adopted son was not accepted as the heir to the throne by Lord Dalhousie, and this was all done under the policy of doctrine of lapse. Now what is this policy of doctrine of lapse? That in any case, if the ruler dies without a natural heir, then this adopted child will not be given the authority, and the entire land or territory or rule or whatever will directly go to the government. So under this, Rani Lakshmi Bai of Jhansi became a bitter enemy of the British government. The other prominent states which came as a victim to the same process of doctrine of lapse were Satara, Jaipur, Udaipur, Nagpur, and Sambalpur. Now the other Indian rulers who were not adversely affected became suspicious, so they lest should meet the same fate. Then there were some rulers like the Mughals who had conquered India and had in course of time settled in India. The revenues that they collected from the Indians were spent in India only. But in the case of Britain, Indians felt that they were being ruled from England and India's wealth was being drained to England and not utilized for their welfare. So this is drain of wealth. That is, India's wealth was felt to be taken away all the way to Britain and was not being used for the welfare of India, whereas some Mughal rulers earlier had already done this. That is, they used to settle down in India, they used to the wealth, whatever used to come to them, was being utilized again back in the welfare of the nation. But in this case, India's wealth was being given away, it was taken away all the way to England. Some Indian states were brought under the British control without actually annexing them. This was done by following the subsidiary alliance introduced by Lord Wellesley. In 1856, Lord Dalhousie annexed Awadh to the company's dominions on the pretext of alleged misrule. But the people of Awadh had to face more hardships. They had to pay higher land revenue and additional taxes on food, houses, ferries, and justice. And let me also tell you, Awadh was the place from where maximum sepoys were in the army. So these come down to as some of the political causes which led to the resentment of Indians against the Britishers. So unjust annexation of Awadh and Berar, and unjust behavior towards the Mughal emperor and Indians, that is the successors of Bahadur Shah's the two announcements. Now we move on to some socio-religious causes. Socio and religious, that means these are the causes that came up from the society and the religion. So they are based on society and religion. Some of the reforms which were introduced by the British, for example, the abolition of sati in 1829, introduction of the Widow Remarriage Act in 1856, and the opening of Western education to girls were not welcomed by the Indians. Somewhere Indians did not feel that these changes are actually required. So these reforms were not reforms, that is, the change was not accepted by the Indians. Then there were some innovations, the modern innovations such as railways and telegraphs. But then these innovations were also misunderstood by the people. People thought that the telegraph poles were erected to hang people who were against the British rule. Similarly, some Orthodox Indians noted that in the railway compartments, the higher castes and the lower castes were made to sit side by side, and they believed that the British had introduced such practice to defy their caste and religion. So this is how these two modern innovations were misunderstood by the Indians. Then the British officers were rude and arrogant towards the Indians. They believed that they were superior to Indians and followed a policy of contempt towards the Indians. The police and the petty officials were all corrupt. The complex judicial system enabled the rich to oppress the poor. So flogging, torture, and imprisonment of cultivators for their inability to pay arrears of rent, land revenue, and interest on debt were quite common. The British also denounced idol worship. There was an increase both in the numbers and activities of the Christian missionaries. The Indians thought that the government was supporting missionaries who would convert them to Christianity. The Western system of education was also introduced in a number of schools in India, and this shifting of emphasis from traditional learning to Western education again was not liked by the people, especially the Pandits and the Maulvis, because Pandits and Maulvis were the respective communities, preachers, like Pandits for Hindus and then Maulvis for the Muslims. They used to render or impart some education. So they saw in it an attempt to discourage traditional Islamic and Hindu studies. There was a Religious Disabilities Act which changed the Hindu law of property, and the religious sentiments of the Indians were hurt by the official policy of taxing lands belonging to the temples and mosques, so the religious places. These were some of the socio-religious causes. Let us now look into economic causes. Now this brought in some exploitation, basically in the field of agriculture, and also it gave a great loss to the handicrafts and trade. Agricultural India was made an economic colony to serve the interest of industrial England. So India was now forced to export at cheaper rates raw materials like raw cotton and raw silk that the British industries needed urgently, plantation products like indigo and tea, and food grains which were in short supply in Britain. These were the raw materials that were being taken at cheaper rate, and they were forced to export the goods. Export of raw materials and food grains deprived India on her agricultural surplus and raised the prices of raw materials. So, India was made to accept all ready-made British goods either duty-free or at nominal duty rates. Now, what is this duty-free? That is, there is no such particular charge on it or trade on it. Like when a particular good has to cross the boundary and reach to the other place, then a duty is levied on it. But here, British goods were made, ready-made British goods were made duty-free, while Indian products were all subjected to high import duties in England. So this is what ruined the Indian industry and deprived the artisans of their income, reducing the employment opportunities for the labor too. Drain of wealth, as what we discussed a few minutes ago, from India to England included the salaries, incomes and savings of the Englishmen, British expenditure in India on the purchase of military goods, office establishment, interest on debt, unnecessary expenditure on the army. Apart from this, the spinning and weaving industry, the spinners and the weavers all were affected, which for ages had given employment to thousands of artisans, and thus now they become extinct. Increase in the land revenue forced many peasants into debt and into selling their lands. The traditional rulers had given financial support to scholars, preachers and men of arts. Indigo trade was highly profitable to the Britishers, but the conditions under which the peasants had to work were inhuman. The peasants were forced to cultivate only indigo in the fields chosen by the British planters. Famines ravaged the country in the second half of the 19th century. The famines were the result of drought, other natural calamities as well as bad administration. British government did nothing to lessen people's misery. The landed aristocracy, which included the talukdars and the hereditary landlords, were all deprived of their estates. These confiscated lands were sold by public auction to the highest bidders. This drove the landed aristocracy to poverty without benefiting the peasantry, which suffered under the weight of exorbitant land revenue. So therefore, these became the economic causes where Indians had a resentment. Apart from all this, there were some military causes where Indian soldiers were poorly paid, ill-fed and badly housed. The British military authorities forbade the sepoys from wearing caste or sectarian marks, beards or turbans, and they showed disregard for the sentiment of the sepoys. According to traditional belief, Indians or Brahmins especially were not supposed to cross the sea. It was a taboo for them. But the British Parliament brought in General Service Enlistment Act in 1856, as per which an Indian soldier could be sent overseas on duty. The Brahmin soldiers here in this act's decision saw a danger to their caste. All the higher positions in employment were reserved for the British, irrespective of their performance. Even the Indian soldiers formerly occupying high positions in the armies of native princes could not rise above the rank of a subadar. Future of Indian soldiers was bleak, without chances of promotions. Now, these Indian soldiers or Indian sepoys were not properly respected. They were seen at a with an inferior attitude, and therefore there was a resentment in them. The Indian soldiers were required to serve in areas which were away from their homes without any extra payment, for which they were not being given any extra payment and additional bhatta. The Post Office Act of withdrew the privilege of free postage which was enjoyed by sepoys. So at least that they could have been able to send letters and write letters and receive letters from their families back at their homes. But then Postage Office Act brought in that they are no more allowed to send letters to their homes. Places of strategic importance like Delhi and Allahabad had no British armies and were wholly held by the Indian soldiers. Besides, England was engaged in several wars outside India. For example, there was Persian or Iranian War, the Crimean War, and the Chinese War. So Indian soldiers had the feeling that the British were in difficulty and the safety of our Indian empire depended on Britishers. So they were therefore determined to strike at them at a suitable time. British Army suffered major reverses in the first Afghan War and the Punjab Wars, in the Crimean War too. This broke the myth that the British were invincible. So it further revealed to the Indian soldiers that the British Army could be defeated by the determined Indian Army. Wages of the Indian soldiers were inadequate to support their families, and on the other hand, the British soldiers received more than 8 times of the salary of the Indian soldiers. So such discrimination can be openly seen in the military. Therefore, these became some military causes and brought a resentment among the Indian sepoys. Out of the sight, there was something which went wrong in 1856, and the British authorities decided to replace the old-fashioned musket, which was called the Brown Bess, by the new Enfield rifle. The loading process of this rifle involved bringing the cartridge to the mouth and biting off the top greased paper with the teeth. In January 1857, there was a rumor in the Bengal regiments that the greased cartridges had the fat of cow or pig. Now, cow, a religious animal to Hindus, and pig, same way, it is religious to the Muslims. So the sepoys were now convinced that the introduction of greased cartridges was a deliberate move to defile Hindu and Muslim religions, as the cow is sacred to Hindus and the pig is a taboo to Muslims. So both Hindus and Muslim soldiers now refused to use the cartridges, and they left the army and staged an uprising when they were forced to use them. And this became an immediate cause, because on 26 February 1857, the 19th Native Infantry at Berhampur in Bengal refused to accept the cartridges. So these cartridges were now, there was a refusal to accept this, and the regiment was disbanded as a warning to other regiments. So they said, like, if we are asked to use this, then we are disbanding our army. The sepoys feared loss of their caste and religion if they accepted the greased cartridges. As a result, there was one sepoy, Mangal Pandey, who led an attack on the adjutant of the 34th Native Infantry at Barakpur on the 29th of March 1857. Mangal Pandey was executed after a court-martial. Now, for his fellow sepoys, he becomes a martyr. Therefore, this became an immediate cause for the military. Now, few events or few leaders and the spread of the uprising. That is, how did this led to the spread? How did people they started coming up with the revenge ideology and the resentment and all. Now, the first one goes as on the 12th of May 1857, now sepoy seized Delhi and Bahadur Shah II was declared as emperor. This was in Delhi. On the 14th of June 1857, an uprising broke at Lucknow, but later it was recaptured by British. Nana Sahib and Tantia Top led the uprising at Kanpur, but later British recaptured Kanpur. In Bareilly, Khan Bahadur Khan and Kuwar Singh revolted. And in Jhansi, it was Rani Lakshmi Bai who died a martyr's death fighting the Britishers for her rights. So this is how there were events which took place all around the country, and these were the leaders who were heading with the revolt of the events. What were the consequences of this uprising? Even though this uprising of 1857 was suppressed, yet it shook the British rule in India to very foundation of it. Now the consequences were the end of the rule of the East India Company. Okay, the company's rule was ended, and assumption of the government of India directly by the crown, and this was done by the Government of India Act of 1858. There was a proclamation, that is Queen's Proclamation, incorporating the transfer of governance from East India Company to the British Crown, and was made public at Allahabad on the 1st of November 1858 by Lord Canning, who was the first Viceroy of India then. This proclamation promised that the Government of India would follow a policy of non-intervention in social and religious matters of Indians. So they won't be interfering into any socio or religious matters of the Indians. It also said and promised for treating all subjects, whether Indians or Europeans, as equals. So education and ability would be the basis of all appointments. That grant of a general pardon to all those who had taken part in the war, except for those who were found guilty of murder of British subjects. So all those prisoners, apart from the ones who are guilty of the murder of the British subjects, the rest would be granted pardon. So with the death of Bahadur Shah II, who was deported to Yangon, Mughal dynasty came to an end. Nana Sahib, the last Peshwa, had taken an active part in the uprising and had fled to Nepal after the failure of the uprising. So the office of the Peshwa also came to an end. Thus, two most formidable foes of the British ended, that is the Marathas and the Mughals. So that there was end of Mughals and the Peshwas. Then the policy of annexation. Policy of annexation was the first policy where the four different methods were used, that is outright wars and subsidiary alliance and doctrine of lapse and on the pretext alleged misrule. So the policy of annexation and the doctrine of lapse were abandoned. The British believed in their racial superiority and they thought that a social distance was to be maintained in order to preserve their authority over the Indians. So, railway compartments, parks, hotels, and clubs, etc., were all now reserved for Europeans only, and the visible manifestation of this racialism was found. So, even the upper caste of Indians from upper caste were also entitled to face such a scenario. The strength of the European troops in India was increased. The ratio of European to Indian troops was fixed as at 1:2, that is Bengal Army, and 2:5 as Madras and Bombay armies. To desist the Indian soldiers from rising again against the British rule, the sophisticated weapons and ammunitions were all taken away from them. I mean, they were not given the charge. The Indians were not given the charge to look after it. So they were never placed under the charge of Indians, because British had this threat or had this fear that Indians might anytime may bring this into use against us. It paved the way for the rise of the national movement, and the heroic struggle of Rani Lakshmi Bai, Nana Sahib and Mangal Pandey also established valuable traditions of resistance to the British rule. During this uprising, both Hindus and Muslims together fought against the British government. After the uprising, British followed a policy of divide and rule. It was a deliberate attempt to so that the two communities might never come together to pose a threat to the British rule in India. So these were the consequences of the uprising in 1857. All in all, nature of the war. Nature of the war is now said to be like whatever be the nature, it was given a name as First War of Independence. That is because it was the first mass uprising in which people from all the sections of the society had participated against a common enemy, that is the British. And secondly, it paved way for the rise of modern national movement. Sacrifices made by Lakshmi Bai, Nana Sahib and Mangal Pandey served as the source of inspiration to the leaders and people to fight for the independence of India from the British rule. So this is all about the uprising, its causes, consequences and the nature of the war. Thank you, children.